Hello everybody, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. So much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And all the better for being with you in your company right now to share with you a wonderful story. So I hope you're going to get that quintessential perfect drink, whatever it is. And if it's something rather unusual, or if you enjoy a Pacific cocktail, let me know all about it. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Candy and I live 25 minutes away from the city of Whitehorse in a spacious custom-designed home on 16 acres of land. Many of the custom-built houses in our part of the world look incredibly alike, with of course the exception of houses that are made from wooden logs. Where I live is so picturesque and stunningly beautiful, and my house has close access to wilderness trails, lakes, mountains and forests. Every time I wake up in the morning, I am literally surrounded by the most exquisite views of magnificent towering mountains reaching into the skies like vast massive pyramids that are particularly spectacular during the winter season when they are carpeted in thick layers of glistening white snow. Where I live is in the Yukon in northern Canada, well known for the stunning visual displays of the northern lights, known as the aurora borealis, that are usually seen whirling in blankets of exquisite greens that literally envelop the Yukon in an ethereal sense of mysterious intrigue. These lights are best seen in the countryside, unobstructed by the city lights of Whitehorse, because obviously the city lights can be distracting. Believe it or not, these glorious lights can sometimes change into rarer colours like pinks and reds and crimsons. I believe that the Yukon is in fact the most ideal place in the entire world for Bigfoots to live, as there is just so much never-ending wilderness here, water sources of so many kinds, and a teeming abundance of wildlife. Before I get to the pinnacle of my story about my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter, let me first explain my family setup to you. I'm the oldest daughter, with a younger sibling called Chloe, and I live in this very large house with both of my parents, whom work in the city of Whitehorse. My father works as a manager for a very well-known North American food chain, and my mother owns a souvenir shop selling trinkets and paintings to tourists who visit our part of the world. We get tons of tourists who come to Whitehorse because they love to go sleigh riding and are fascinated by the northern lights. And there's so much to do here, the list goes on. There's all kinds of things to do for outdoor enthusiasts and people who like action-packed holidays. Even in 2018, I actually saw the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in Horsetail, and they spent 24 hours in the city on their royal tour of Canada, and I actually got to speak to Kate. That was 2 months after my Bigfoot encounter had occurred, to be exact. My story begins when one day my sister and I were on a summer break. And although there are tons of interesting things to do in the city of Whitehorse, we decided to go exploring one of the hiking trails that are literally yards away from our home. I mean, why not? We thought it would be great to go camping along the trail for a couple of days or so. My parents were nonchalant about us going, as long as we didn't camp too far away from the house, and took a rifle with us for protection, just in case we had an encounter with a bobcat or a bear. This all happened 2 years ago, to be precise, in 2018, when I was 17 years old and Candy was only 15. I'm ashamed to say that even though I've lived in this house for 17 long years, not once did I ever explore the trail close to our home. In truth, there are not many people that I've ever seen using that hiking trail before, as it isn't clearly marked. It's pretty old, rugged and slightly overgrown. My dad reckons it's not been used since the turn of the century, and he's probably right. He said he couldn't find it anywhere when he was looking at a tourist map more recently. So it's an exceedingly old trail, leading to an area that I doubt has been frequented by hikers in recent years. Chloe and I are always prepared for the outdoors, as you can invariably imagine. I'm always kitted out with walking shoes, anoraks, camping equipment, you name it, because we have a very active outdoor life that involves swimming, canoeing, bicycling, horse riding and even fishing. Believe me, Chloe and I have done it all. My sister and I got our backpacks prepared with everything we would need for our camping trip, such as flashlights, fire starters, sleeping bags, tents, and all the usual necessities. We then left on our merry way for our little adventure. We were very excited because it was just two of us camping under the stars, and the weather was seemingly perfect. We couldn't have wished for anything better. The first part of our hike was pretty strenuous and very exhausting because it was all uphill, and the trail ran through a vast wooded area filled with a selection of mixed trees, from spruces, firs, pines, cedars and maple birch trees, and it was all enchantingly beautiful. We ran across a startled red fox that scurried away hurriedly, looking less than pleased to see us, and of course we encountered several snowshoe hares along our way, darting around the place looking surprised to encounter humans, almost as if they were saying, "What on earth are you doing here? You don't fit in around here." It was such a beautiful day, and my sister and I walked for hours, rarely enjoying the soft beams of sunlight on our faces. We listened to the beautiful bird song in the valley and watched the occasional moose that crossed our path and quickly tottered away. We finally reached a clearing, and it was the oddest thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. On the left-hand side of this wide open space was a very large area that looked exactly like an ancient Indian burial ground, only that did not make any sense at all, because this was not an old burial ground by any means, but was exceedingly fresh. And although I'm no expert on these matters, I would say that none of these burial plots were more than 5 years old. There were about 8 mounds of freshly dug earth in the shape of very large, long graves, at approximately 8 to 10 feet in length and equally as wide, so these things were pretty massive. On the sides of each mounds were layers of big stones, and the individual graves were marked with strange sticks poking out of the ground, looking like weird kinds of menacing symbols, almost as if every stick represented the individual that had died in some kind of mystery code. "What in God's name is all this?" said Chloe, looking at me in horror. "This looks like the grave site of giants." We immediately got out of the area as fast as we could. The whole place had an ominous, airy feeling about it that left the hair on our necks standing on edge. A while of extra strenuous and exhilarating walking uphill led us to another open clearing, where we stumbled quite by chance upon another extraordinary sight that was so well camouflaged by the underlying brush that we almost failed to see it. I only happened to notice it because a very large black raven was perched on a branch close to the structure, and it was making that cawing sound that they usually make, which immediately got my attention. I studied the bird closely, and my eyes wandered towards the stacked basket-like formation standing beneath it. It looked like a massive igloo-type structure that was as big as a small hut, made with branches, twigs, and intertwined with vine leaves. We knew at once that something highly intelligent had actually made this hut, but who or what we could not imagine. We walked inside the igloo-like structure, made of leaves and branches, and we saw some deerskins carpeting one area of the floor that covered a huge pile of grasses, making what appeared to be a makeshift bed that did look exceedingly comfortable and absolutely enormous. Whoever was lying here had to be huge. We saw a pile of what looked like sharpened stones and pieces of wood that reminded me of the instruments that Stone Age men used in prehistoric times. It was all utterly bizarre. I picked up some of those sharpened stones, and it was so sharp, I kid you not, I nearly sliced my finger off, much to my horror. None of my mother's kitchen knives at home were ever this sharp. Chloe and I were utterly bewildered and intrigued at the same time. We couldn't make sense of any of this. It was all so outer-worldly. It was almost like we had been teleported back to another time, like the Stone Ages. As we were leaving this igloo-like structure of branches and leaves, we noticed a fire pit outside the opening, and it had been used very recently, because we could tell that the ash was still warm to the touch. "It must be some wacko human living here," I said to my sister. "Someone who takes living off the grid to an extreme, and lives as close to nature as you can imagine." "Either that," said Chloe, "or maybe he's a psycho that escaped from the loony bin." She suddenly looked at me in alarm. "What about all those graves we saw? Maybe the psycho is going around killing people and burying them there." "We could be next," she said, with a look of horror growing on her face. "Chloe," I scolded, "stop being so melodramatic. You watch too many of those ghastly horror movies. For a start, we don't know if those are actually graves in the first place. And for all we know, it's just a harmless vagrant who lives in here." "Harmless," said Chloe. "Really? You think it's harmless when it sharpened those stones to a fine point that nearly sliced your finger off? And you reckon he's harmless?" I was just about to scold Chloe again for overreacting when we heard the sound of very heavy feet coming towards us. Bear in mind, we were carrying backpacks at the time that had an awful propensity to rattle when we moved. I gestured to Chloe to be as quiet as possible, and we made it in time to hide behind the trunk of a very large cedar tree, where we hid, hardly daring to breathe. Whatever was coming towards us sounded as hefty as a large elephant, without exaggeration, only it was someone who was bipedal, because they were definitely walking on 2 feet. I decided that it had to be the vagrant or the vagabond in the woods, who must be a seriously overweight individual to sound that massive, which was somewhat incongruous, I thought, for a man of the woods, who I thought should always be svelte and very fit. I appeared around the corner of the tree and was not prepared for what I was actually witnessing. It was a humanoid creature of about 10 to 11 feet tall that looked like a wild man, covered in long reddish-brown hair from head to toe. He had an elongated scowl and a pinky-brown hairless face that appeared rugged, weathered, incredibly leathered and extremely wrinkled. I'd heard of Bigfoots before, but this creature was more human than ape-like in his appearance. He was monstrously huge. I would say he was about 1,000 pounds and 6 feet in width, and he had the longest arms that I've ever seen in my life that fell well below his knees and could easily touch his toes. I can honestly say that this hairy humanoid is the scariest, most powerful, formidable creature that I've ever seen, equally on par with encountering a tiger or a lion. All I wanted to do in that moment was to hightail it as fast as I could out of the woods. I was utterly terrified. Just looking at this creature, while he was oblivious to our presence, literally sent waves of dread down my spine, and terror coursing through every vein in my body like a relentless steam train powered on full throttle, because the more that I observed this creature, the more terrified I became. Chloe and I had been walking all day. By now we were utterly exhausted, tired, and ravenous. And so when the humanoid creature ventured inside the igloo grass-like structure where he clearly lived, I pushed Chloe forward. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. "Now!" "I don't think I could move another muscle," Chloe moaned. "My legs are aching and everything hurts. I'm so tired and so hungry." "We need to camp as far away from him as possible," I said to Chloe. "Just try and walk a little bit further. Tomorrow we'll turn around and go back home. I promise." "This place has weirded me out," said Chloe. "I've never been so freaked out by something before. We should never have taken this trail. No one uses it anymore for good reason, it seems." Finally, Chloe and I found a little clearing close to a pretty creek, and it was far away enough from the giant humanoid for us to camp, making us feel a whole lot safer. We prepared a large fire pit, boiled some hot water to make a brew of sweet tea, and then we cooked some marinated chicken kebabs that I'd brought over the open grill, and we sat back and spoke about what we'd seen. "He wasn't human," said Chloe, looking at me intently, chewing a piece of chicken hungrily. "But he wasn't an ape either, was he?" "So is he a Bigfoot or not?" she asked. "He must be some kind of a Bigfoot," I said. "I imagine you get all types. Some may have more human-like characteristics, while others may look like apes more, I imagine." "Well, he did have very long arms and an exceedingly prominent brow ridge, so typical of a Bigfoot, I suppose," reflected Chloe, who knew just about everything there was to know about Bigfoot as a subject, because she had always been intrigued and fascinated by it for many years. However, I think our encounter with the hairy humanoid had shaken her to the core, because even though she tried to hide it, I could see she was well and truly rattled. "Whatever he was," I said, "he gave me the chills. He was one of the scariest creatures, whether he was a Bigfoot or not. That night we went to bed early. Our muscles were aching from our strenuous walking, and we couldn't wait to get some sleep. It was not long before we were fast asleep, leaving the strange experience of our peculiar day long behind us as we entered into a blissful dreamlike state. Suddenly at about 2 a.m. in the morning, we were awoken to something very big and heavy thumping our tent. We could actually watch the imprint of a hefty hand hitting our tent many times over, and whatever or whoever it was, they were making no secret of their presence. "It's him," whispered Chloe in horror. "I think he's going to kill us." I immediately grabbed my rifle, wondering whether to confront the creature or just stay in our tent and not react to the slapping sounds. While I was contemplating the next course of action, Chloe and I quickly placed our light helmets on for visibility and slipped into our walking shoes. By this time a short while had passed, and the slapping sounds on our tent had all but receded. I peered out of the tent very briefly, but saw nothing there, so I beckoned to Chloe that the coast was clear, and we ran for cover to some nearby trees, with our rifles at the ready. Soon we saw him again, the monstrous humanoid we had encountered yesterday. He was stomping around our camping spot like a grumpy old man, looking less than pleased. He began to growl, roar, and howl simultaneously, and then he started to shake our tents violently, creating the effect of a hazardous windstorm. He was trying to scare us out of our tents, like a fox prizing a rabbit out of its hole. Believe me, I was so relieved we were not in there. Suddenly the creature just tore our entire tent apart, and he shredded the tough canvas as if it was just tissue paper with his monstrous hands and dexterous sausage-like fingers. He then pulled our sleeping bags apart, and they dotted the clearing like pieces of firecrackers found after a July the 4th celebration. In his hands we literally watched this man bend the metal back of our packs like a piece of plasticine. We watched him just throw everything around the clearing like a rampaging rhino in an incandescent rage. Food parcels hung perilously on tree branches, and the rest of our clothes were strewn all over the place like a child's messy bedroom. Chloe and I were frozen to the spot in absolute fear. We simply could not move our bodies. We were immobilized by the escalating terror that we were feeling. Forget what they say about adrenaline giving you the ability to run away as fast as you can. Chloe and I were paralyzed by fear. We shook like jellies, and we just stood there like sitting ducks, almost waiting to be devoured by this enraged predator. Suddenly we heard him coming towards us. He must have sensed us or smelt us, and his flat nostrils flared up, and his mouth curled back like a large cat to reveal a huge set of white human-like teeth. He growled at us, and that sound was so terrifying it was beyond anything I can ever start to describe, but it caused the ground to vibrate and to shake, and our eardrums to almost burst. If looks could kill, and if I ever saw hatred and evil, it was in those big brown eyes that held not an ounce of humanity in them. It was like they were devoid of any compassion. I truly sensed that this creature wanted to kill us. There was no doubt in my mind about that. "Shoot him," begged Chloe. "Shoot him, Candy, please." I want to tell you, against this monstrous beast, I truly felt like a silly little toddler, bringing out a kid's water pistol that I was pointing at the creature. My hands were shaking so very much, and how I managed to aim that rifle I will never know. But the booming sound of the pistol got the creature even madder. He started lunging towards me, reaching out with a monstrous hairy hand to grab me, while he roared at me at the same time. I pointed the rifle at his jaw and blew off a corner of his face. I could hardly believe I'd done it. The creature looked totally startled as some of his teeth and a piece of jaw went flying into the air like pieces of shrapnel. I think he was in desperate pain because he let out a shrill, agonizing scream, and clutching his jaw that was oozing with blood, he ran away from us as fast as he could. Chloe and I were startled out of our frozen comatose state, and suddenly we were energized with a seemingly superhuman energy that enabled us to run through that wooded clearing as fast as we possibly could. When we got home, we were so knocked out and so utterly exhausted that we slept for 24 hours straight. Once we'd recovered, the first words out of my father's mouth was, "What the hell happened to you both? What on earth did you see?" We told our horrified parents our startling story, and my father is convinced we encountered a wild man or a Bigfoot of some kind. I truly do not know what we actually saw. Is there a difference between a Bigfoot and a wild man? I do not know the answer to that question, but whatever we saw, it did behave like a rabid dog. I would expect something that looked more human to be less violent, but this thing was exceedingly dangerous. I do believe if it had not blown off the corner of his jaw, that Chloe and I would be dead by now. I'm in no doubt in my mind about that. My experience has put me off hiking, because I believe the more common hikers' trails are invariably safer. So it hasn't put me off hiking, because I think they're much safer if you go on the normal hiking routes. I think these things, whatever they are exceedingly territorial and stay away from humans. I'm convinced there are others like him living in the Yukon because of the burial ground that we saw. So if you are the type of person who prefers an action-filled holiday rather than sunning yourself on a tropical beach, why not consider popping up to Horsetail? Who knows, you might end up buying a trinket from my mother's shop. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for that incredible story. I do not know what you saw, and it'll be interesting to see what other listeners will think about your sighting of this creature, because he does sound much more human than the average Bigfoot. Is there a wild man that is much more human-like than Bigfoot himself? Until next time, goodbye and good night.